Thank you very much, Horace and Angela. Thank you for the invitation to this prestigious series of seminar. I have watched several previous ones, and I really enjoy and was stimulating by those. And so here I want to take again on the DMA and the DSA, but as Alice was saying, what I wanted to do is first to take a specific angle, which is the enforcement angle, and which is, I think, one of the most difficult one. And yet, I mean, to have a good rule without a good enforcement, it's totally useless. And also to try to discuss the DSA and the DMA together, which, as Alice was saying, often they are discussed separately by separate community. It's mostly the human rights community which are discussing the DSA because it's mostly about content moderation, and the antitrust/economic regulation community, which is discussing the DMA because it's about economic regulation. But, you know, both instruments have been proposed together and are supposed to be enforced together. And so there is clearly an issue of synergies in the enforcement that I would like to discuss with you. So let me share the slides I have prepared for this talk, and then start. In the half hour that I have now, and then we will have the discussion, I really would like to do four things. So first, to recall very briefly for those who don't know what is the DMA and the DSA, but I mean, I will be very brief because I guess most of you knows that. And then go to the heart of the topic, which is the enforcement challenges, and see what are the challenges, and also most importantly, what are the possible solutions. Because I think, you know, it's very well to raise problem, and academics are very good at that, but it's even better when you come with solutions. And then I will compare what the Commission has proposed compared to what I have in mind as an optimal enforcement. And then finally, how what the Commission has proposed could be improved in the short term during the political negotiation that are taking place now, and then maybe in the longer term. And then I will finish with some takeaway. So as you know, the big indication of the DMA and the DSA is that the party for the big platform is over, and the famous independence of the cyberspace that Barlow 25 years ago was calling for, this is clearly not anymore on the agenda, and for good reason, I think. But I really would like you to recommend to go back to this Barlow declaration on the independence of the cyberspace, because in a way, you know, it's extremely naive. You know, it was promising, you know, a kind of internet which was better than what the states have achieved, and to some extent it is true. But we have also a lot of problems on the internet that Barlow did not anticipate it, and that now the states have to deal with. So all over the world, in the US, in China, in Australia, and in Europe, there is no regulatory push to you know, intervene and police the cyberspace. And so in Europe, among different proposals, two important ones have been made in December last year and are currently negotiating. The Digital Market Act, which is really about economic regulation, ensuring contestability, B2B fairness, and internal market, how by imposing a series of obligations and prohibition on the biggest platform. And then we have the Digital Services Act, which is mostly about ensuring a safe, predictable, and trust cyberspace while respecting the fundamental right. And that here, the idea is to impose due diligence obligation, in particular to try to check and then remove illegal content and materials. And that is applicable, the DSA would be applicable to all digital platforms, but then with a proportionality. So the bigger you are, the more obligation you will have. Okay, so that's basically what the two proposals are about. Now, you remember this famous sentence which was attributed to Bill Clinton. It's the economy stupid in the presidential US presidential campaign. And here we could say it's enforcement stupid, because very often, you know, in EU law we have good law, Then we have bad or weak enforcement. And then what we do is we change the law instead of changing the enforcement. So it's very, very important to have the enforcement right. Otherwise, I mean, everything you do will not work. Now, it's particularly important for big tech because we have a series of challenges which is making the enforcement particularly difficult. First, we have a lot of platforms, in particular, if you talk about the DSA, and some of them are very big and global. Second, we have a large asymmetry of information between the platform, who know best their product, and then the regulators. Now, the asymmetry of information is not something new, but it is exacerbated here because products are new and evolving very fast. So we have a complexity also in the value chain that we should not underestimate. And finally, many of those products have important systemic impact on the economy and the society and the fundamental. Okay, so a lot of difficulties and not a lot of experience, because to date there was very little EU law on digital platform. They were largely unsupervised. So a lot of difficulty and no experience. So that, in a way, is the recipe for disaster, if you will. So I think we need to be extremely careful, and what I think we need to have is a form of centralization, or what I call semi-centralization, in the sense that we should have centralized enforcement for the biggest platform, not for every platform, not for a very small platform, but for the very big one. We need a centralized enforcement. Why? Because they are big, so they are rich and powerful. So you will face, as an enforcer, one of the biggest, among the biggest company or the biggest companies of the world, and they are tech, so it's complex and difficult. So I really think that we need a centralized enforcement, and if you want to approve of that, just compare how financial regulation is done against the systemic bank, so the biggest bank of Europe, which is this enforcement is centralized at the ECB, at the single supervision mechanism, with the relatively, I would say, disaster of the GDPR enforcement against the big tech. Now, we will see, we know that there is this new decision against Amazon by the Luxembourgian regulators, but you know, who could really think that the Irish and the Luxembourgian regulators have an incentive and let alone the ability to enforce right appropriately the GDPR against those very big companies. So really, I think that if you think about incentive and ability, you cannot just rely on the enforcer of one country. And in general, those platforms are established in a very small country of Europe. So one thing is centralization. The other thing is what I have called with a colleague in a paper, an ecosystem of enforcement. So as you know, the success of those platforms comes from the fact that they manage to orchestrate an ecosystem between business user and end user. I think the success of enforcement here will depend on whether the regulator, in this case the Commission, if we go for a centralized enforcement, manage to orchestrate an ecosystem of enforcement, which involve the platform themselves. And there, I think, to have internal mechanisms such as risk assessment and compliance officer are very useful. To have also an important role for business user and end user, and they are actively involved in the oversight and enforcement. And then to have a series of soft law, code of conduct, individual and general guidelines to help to give more legal certainty. There again, I think we can learn a lot from financial regulation, because that's what has been developed in financial regulation since a long time. And so we have again some experience in other industries, which can be helpful for us. So two things: centralized enforcement and orchestrating an ecosystem of enforcement. Now, let's go to what the Commission had proposed in the DMA and then in the DSA. In the DMA, I would say the Commission proposal is relatively simple, and I would say too simple to be true or to be effective, in the sense that the Commission says, okay, we will enforce the DMA ourselves, and mostly in a bilateral dialogue or a conflict with the platform. Okay, because you know the DMA enforcement is very much modeled on what happened on antitrust, and this is what happened on antitrust. You have an antitrust authority, you have a dominant company, and there is a kind of dialogue which is at times adversarial, and then you end up with a decision or with commitment. So a relatively little role for the national regulator, and no clear for all the other stakeholders. So those business users, those end users, those competitor, civil society. I mean, it's not that they are excluded, but at least their role is not very explicitly made in the proposal. No, the Commission says, yes, that's fine, because enforcement should not be that difficult, because what we have opted for, contrary to what you find in the UK proposal, for instance, or in some US bills, we have opted for very detailed rules instead of broad standard. And so those very detailed rules are supposed to be very easy to administer. It's true that detailed rules are easier to administer than broad standard, but I don't think, contrary to what the Commission is always saying, that it will be self-executing, because I really think that in such a complex environment, and I'm not alone, I think many of you which are attending here have written more or less in the same direction. Self-execution in such a complex industry like digital is really a mirage. You don't, it's impossible. And if you have to have a proof of it, look at the number of cases which were taken in consumer protection against a number of social network or hosting platform for the application of the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive. Now, in the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, you have also a list of detailed prohibition, nearly 40 now. And, you know, some of them, it was not clear what it meant for those platforms. And so the Commission and the different national consumer protection authority had to take a number of coordinated action, what's called coordinated action, against Facebook, against Airbnb, to clarify what the law means for them and to ask them to change their time of reference. So really, I mean, self-execution, that's what we can learn from those experiences in consumer protection. Self-execution do not work in digital. The second thing, no, that doesn't mean that I am for broad standard. I just want to say that it won't be easy even if you use a detailed rule. And I think the DSA system enforcement is a little bit more complex, but clearly much better. Well, first, you have a kind of different level because you cover more platform. The DSA cover more platform, cover small and big platform. For smaller platform, you will have the digital services coordinator of the country, of the member states, where the platform is established, which will be in charge of regulation. And then for the biggest one, it will be mostly the Commission. So here we have more or less the same regime as we have in financial regulation, where for smaller banks, they are supervised by the country of where the bank is established. And for the biggest bank, the systemic bank, they are supervised by the EC. So not exactly the same system, but the same idea. So that's better. That's good. And then you have, and this is what I think the DSA is much better than the DMA, you really have this idea of an ecosystem of oversight, in the sense that the platform have to have their own internal compliance and compliance officer, in the sense that a specific role is given to user, trust flagger, civil societies, and so on. So clearly, I mean, the stakeholders have a much clearer explicit role in the DSA than in the DMA, and therefore I think the DMA has a lot to learn from the DSA. No. where I see some improvement. And here, I think there is two dimensions in the improvement that I want to propose to you. First, if we keep the idea that it's the European Commission in charge of the DSA and the DMA, what needs to be improved? And then I will go to a kind of a more radical reform, but which could only take place, I think, in a medium to long term, and that is the establishment of European regulatory agencies next to the Commission. So first is, if you think that the centralized enforcement should be in the hands of the European Commission, I think one thing you could do, what I think you should do, is to maximize the synergies between the different Commission power. Because, you know, once the DMA and the DSA will be adopted, the Commission will have three types of power: the competition law power, the DMA power, and the DSA power. Now, of course, they are with different objectives, but they relate to the same company, same algorithm, same database. So I think you have in synergies. So for instance, you should organize the way of transferring information from one investigation to another, from a DMA investigation to an antitrust investigation, or from a DSA investigation to a DMA investigation. Now, if you don't have a legal basis for that, you cannot do that. Second, you really have to think about how the remedy can complement each other and not substitute each other. Second, and this is also a point that has been made by Philippe Marsten, who is now here, and I concur with what he has written, we need to have within the Commission a good organization to do that, and it should not be just DG Comp in charge of the DMA. Given the synergies that you have with the DSA, you need to be broader in how, in the services, in the Director General involved in the system. And finally, given the fact that the Commission will have at least three powers, it will be, the Commission should say in advance for legal certainty when it will be used which power. Now, the division between the DSA on the one hand and the competition law and the DMA is clearer because they are really related to two different things. But the relationship between the DMA and competition law is not totally clear. And so I think the Commission should say when it sees a practice which is not yet covered by the DMA, but could be added thanks to the flexibility clause of the DMA, whether it will use competition law or whether it will use a regulation. Now, again, that's not a new debate. In the UK, most of the sectoral regulators have concurrent power, so they have explained and adopted guidelines explaining when they will use competition law, when they will use regulation. The second thing which is very important in strengthening the Commission is to ensure effectiveness and legitimacy. Now, we know that European law is imposing to every national regulatory authority to be independent, not only of the operator they are regulated, that's very obvious, but also from the political power. Okay. Now, here we have a problem because the Commission wants to become more and more a political actor, a geopolitical actor, as von der Leyen is saying. So we have a tension between an independence requirement, which is shown to be important for good regulation, and then an aspiration by the Commission to become more a geopolitical actor. And so this is why I think this tension, we can leave it now, but at some point it will be too much. And this is why I think in the second stage, we will need to establish a European agency out of the Commission. We also need to have expertise. And here really, I mean, the Commission just for the DMA is thinking about 80 people. That's clearly not enough. I think everybody recognizes that that's not enough. But more than the number of the staff, the composition of the staff is very important. And what you really need here is to have good AI specialists and data analysts. Now, there, for instance, the CMA has been extremely good in building a very strong team of data analysts and AI specialists, but the Commission is nowhere there. So here, really, we have also an issue. And so that led me to think, like many others, that the national agencies needs to be involved more clearly in the enforcement. But here, you know, I think everybody agree with that. But then where the disagreement lies is what should be the role of those national agencies. Should be just in support of the centralized enforcement by the Commission, like we have, for instance, in financial regulation, because in the single supervision mechanism, in fact, for every investigation, you have a joint team which is constituted by staff from the ECB and staff from the national financial supervisor. Or should we go one step further and go also for a decentralized enforcement, and so give an autonomous power to the national agencies to enforce the DMA? And that we have also a model in EU law, that is EU competition law, where EU competition law may be enforced by DG Comp, but also by the National Competition Authority. Now, so we have two models here, and there is clearly a debate now in the Council and in the Parliament to go to decide which model will prevail. I think the antitrust authority needs to privilege the decentralized enforcement model, because also this is what they know, while the regulatory authorities involved in the debate tends to privilege the support to centralized enforcement, like BEREC, for instance. Now, those are two options. I am in favor of the first option, but I can understand the argument for the second, so we can discuss that. Then the next issue is, if we go for just support to centralized enforcement, what will be the role of the national authority? And here I think their role should be linked to their added value or their comparative advantage compared to the Commission. And I think they have a comparative advantage in terms of dealing with local complaints, because the big tech are global, but their users are often local. In terms of remedy design, because they have some experience, for instance, if you talk about interoperability, telecom regulators have a lot of experience to do that. And then in terms of compliance monitoring, again, because they are closer to the field, they are maybe better placed to see whether a remedy is really respected. And then if you go for the more radical model of decentralized enforcement, then again, the question is, what do you decentralize? Do you decentralize the whole DMA? So designation of the gatekeeper, design of the obligation, sanction in case of no compliance, or do you decentralize only part of it? Okay, so depending of what you think, how much you want to decentralize, you will end up with a different regime. And finally, I think a last point, which is very important, is that what regime do you use? I think it's very important that those national authorities in charge should be independent and not ministries. Okay, and also it should be composed of antitrust authority, obviously, but not only. Could be also consumer, data protection, telecom, media authority, which is a lot of experience in content moderation. The second thing is that we also need to have participatory regulation, or this ecosystem of oversight. So this participatory concept was coined by Jean Tirole some years ago. He was talking about participatory antitrust, but you can also apply that to regulation. And as I said before, I think on that, the DMA has a lot to learn from the DSA in involving much better the stakeholders into the system. Now, as I said, I think over the years, this tension between the political role that the Commission wants to play and may play more and more as Europe becomes more and more politically integrated, and the requirement of independence from political power that you normally have for good regulation and that EU law imposes itself to national regulators will lead, I think, at some point to this debate, this very old debate, whether do we need a European digital agency. Now, I said it's very old because if you go back to the '94 Bangemann report on information society, which was, you know, a big high-level group report on what Europe should do to become a leader in information society. Clearly, we didn't manage so far, but one of the recommendations was to have a European agency. Now, I would not say that we didn't manage because we didn't have a European agency, obviously, but I just want to say here that it is a recommendation. Now, of course, then the lawyers jump in and say, oh, no, you cannot do that because there is this old Meroni case, which is a case of the Court of Justice which dates back of the 50s. So even before the European Economic Community, it is the European Steel and Coal Community, where the court was relatively reluctant to the creation of, with regard to the creation of an independent authority next to the Commission with regulatory power. Now, I must say that since then, there has been other cases, and there has been the ESMA case in financial regulation, which has a bit toned down a little bit the Meroni doctrine, and clearly cannot, we cannot have a kind of say that it's totally prohibited to establish a European regulatory authority. So I think that if you design it carefully, I think it would be legally feasible, but we can discuss that. And then the last question is then, okay, that's very good to have a European agency, but to do what? And so to do what? I think clearly to enforce the DSA and the DMA against the big tech, that's obvious. That's an obvious candidate, sorry. But we could think even further. Maybe we could say the data protection, so the GDPR, for the enforcement of the GDPR against the big tech, not against everyone, but against the big tech, should also be to the competence to the European Digital Agency. All the rules on online content moderation, which are in the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, which are in the Terrorism Content Directive, and which will be also in the DSA, maybe should also be in the hands of this European Digital Agency. We may go one step further and say also the consumer protection should also be there. Why I have chosen those instruments? Because there is a lot of synergies between all of them. This is why I think it makes sense to give them to the same authority. And finally, what about competition? Now here, of course, you cannot transfer, I think, the enforcement of 101 and 102 to a European agencies without changing the treaty. Okay, and I based my analysis on the hypothesis that we don't want to change the treaty. And so therefore, I think 101 and 102 should remain in the Commission. Merger regulation, it's maybe a bit more open because it's mostly in the Council regulation that you have the enforcement issue. But also we may imagine that we would need a kind of new type of merger control or complementary type of merger control for digital gatekeeper, which would come in addition to the normal merger control. You know, and that would not be so strange. If you go to media company, you know, you always have the normal, let's say, competition law analysis, and then you have the plurality analysis. So to me, it won't be completely foolish to say, okay, we will, for the big platform, because there is some specific issue, next to the normal merger control, which will be left to the Commission, to have another kind of merger control with specific contestability and fairness objectives or criteria, normative criteria that you could give to these European digital agencies. And finally, in terms of internal organization, here now we have a kind of common approach which has been adopted by the 3 EU institutions, Commission, Parliament, and Council, on how you create European agencies with a management board composed of representatives of the member states, with an executive board, an executive director, with a board of appeal, which I think is useful because then you have a kind of a specialized board of appeal first, and then maybe the decision of the board of appeal can be appealed before the Court of Justice. And then, which would be very important here, is a kind of a stakeholder committee to keep, you know, a connection with the stakeholders, which is, as I have said, so important. So to summarize everything, I think clearly oversight and enforcement is absolutely key, and to me is not enough thought through in the Commission proposal as they are now. We need centralization, and we need centralization for the big tech. So I'm not calling for a centralization on all the enforcement of digital law. And participation, that is very, very important. The Commission proposal, DSA and the DMA, goes in the right direction, but could be improved, in particular by maximizing the synergies of the different Commission concurrent power and in increasing the involvement of the national agencies in support of the centralized enforcement. But I think on the medium term, what we would need is a European digital regulators. Well, if you want to know more, I have published with some colleague two paper with Pierre Laroche, two paper on the DMA, and where some of those issues are touched, and then another very short issue paper on this new way of oversight of enforcement in the digital economy with Michel Ledger. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. It was really, unsurprisingly, it was really illuminated and, you know, really insightful. And it